Thank you so much for coming. I was like, oh, it's the afternoon of the third day. Literally no one's going to be there. I'm going to be talking about relationships with myself. But thank you so much for coming. I have 25 minutes, which means I can do my spiel in 25 minutes, but you're a small enough group. Oh, hi, team members are here. You're a small enough group that you can also interrupt me and we can have a bit of a conversation. I'm actually going to come down off the stage also because this is just too high and mighty for my taste. So I'm Julia Freeland Fisher. I'm the Director of Education Research at the Clayton Christensen Institute. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that studies disruptive innovation in the public sector. And our education work looks at innovations arising both in the K-12 and higher ed spaces. And when I joined the Institute 6 years ago, we were best known for our work in online and blended learning and how those were really radically changing both access and pedagogy. And I had this sneaking suspicion, which was that technology has this immense power to connect us, and yet, if you look at the mainstream EdTech market, do you want me up on the stage instead? Okay, you looked annoyed at me. If you look at the mainstream EdTech market, at least 5 years ago, we were using technology as a content gun, as an assessment tool, and as a productivity tool, not as a tool to connect. And that was crazy to me, given that social capital and who you know actually matters immensely. So I start every talk with a bit of an existential question, which is how did you get here? And I don't mean what airline or what plane, train, or automobile, but I mean how did you get to your current position in your job, in your life, that allowed you to come to a high-octane fancy conference in San Diego and network? And maybe more importantly, who helped you? So my version of this, how did I get up here talking to you guys? I knew someone who knew the people organizing this conference, and we pitched them to say, oh, Julia has this research to talk about, can you let her get up there? And here I am, right? So even how I got here today was a chain of relationships, not just sort of what I know. However, if you look at how we talk about human capital, what we know, what we can do, what the labor market will pay us to do, we often ignore a series of questions that reflect the social aspects of opportunity. The people who helped you get by early days, or maybe today, depending on what you're going through in your life, the people who helped you get ahead. And I will just say, I know that people self-selected to come here, so I don't get to have my rah-rah soapbox moment, because I think you're all sort of interested in this topic. But at this conference, these questions are not getting asked enough. The rhetoric around the skills gap is eclipsing what is a troubling network gap that affects access to opportunity. So what we're going to talk about today is some of the data on what networks look like right now, particularly for K-12 young people in the country, and then what promising innovations are starting to emerge that actually put more and new relationships within reach and actually strengthen the relationships that are already in young people's lives. Does that make sense? Cool. Oh, who helps you persist is also important. So this is a little bit of a mental model. Like I said, human capital, what you know, is for anyone working in the K-12 system, the thing that we talk about. We are obsessed with what students know and what students do not know, right? And we do that, I think, to the detriment of ignoring whom they know. And the reality is that opportunity actually sits at the cross-section of these two. One of the statistics that undergirds why we did this research is that if you're an average American, half of you got your jobs through a personal connection. If you are on LinkedIn, 80% of you got your jobs through a referral, right? So that's what the data says, that people are getting jobs through networks. This is also not just sort of a job-getting agenda, right? Because if you think about the purpose of our K-12 system, it's not just to prepare little widgets for the labor market, it's also to prepare good citizens and humans for our society. And the longest-running studies of adult development actually suggest that the leading predictor of happiness and health in old age is warm relationships. So this is both a conversation about relationships mattering as gateways to opportunity, but also as relationships as fundamental ingredients to what it means to thrive as a human. Now, those of you who've been in education for a while know that there's actually a lot of research about the role of relationships and what it plays at various junctures in the sort of K-12 trajectory. This is my one slide that's a spoof of a researcher with 19,000 words on the slide. I can also share my slides after if you don't want to read all the words. But what I'm trying to get at here is that starting very early, networks matter. Did anyone read the Lost Einstein study from Raj Chetty? You know what I'm talking about? This is a study that came, I'm going up here because I'm getting like queasy walking around too much. This is a study that came out last year, and Raj Chetty, who's studying sort of the landscape of opportunity in America, his team was looking at what led young people to participate in the innovation economy. Now, they used a kind of funny metric, which was how many young people grew up and registered for patents. But what should shock all of you and make you worried about the future of our economy is that mediocre, affluent students are way more likely to register for a patent down the line than our highest aptitude low-income students. And they were able to trace that back to exposure to networks of people working in the innovation economy. What that tells us is that even early on, having students be able to interact with professionals working in that knowledge economy can shape their trajectory. I'm not going to belabor all of these details, but along other junctures along the way, we also know that relationships matter immensely. So America's Promise Alliance has done a ton of research on the fact that a caring adult relationship is a key lever to keep students in school, right? It's also a key lever to re-engage dropouts. And so we can talk a lot about sort of tests and tutors and academic supports, but there's a social support infrastructure that's really critical. And lastly, I moderated a panel this morning on post-secondary, so I'm also like trying to say K-12 words, but thinking in post-secondary terms. So apologies if I'm doing that. But if you fast forward to post-secondary and job getting, support networks and diverse mentors and networks into the knowledge economy predict all sorts of success. Now, you can buy all of this, but in our traditional system, along each of these little buckets, we sometimes actually do start mentoring kids, or we start providing a relationship, and then we move on to the next intervention. And what our research is arguing is that if we actually want to address network gaps, each of these is a chance to invest in students' networks along the way and collect relationships as they go, because relationships themselves are outcomes. I'm just going to pause on that for a second. Right now, our mental model is that relationships are inputs to learning and development, and that's totally fine. But if you buy those statistics about relationships as access to opportunity and thriving, we actually have a chance along the way to be investing in students' networks. I'm using this term sort of social capital, and have folks heard that term before? So this has been around for a while, and there's, like any term in academic research, there's like a lot of debates about what it means. Robert Putnam, who's a researcher from Harvard, is really popular for his book Bowling Alone. It came out sort of pointing out the decline of civic membership as a sign that social capital was declining. I'm not a huge fan of his measures for this conversation because he measures social capital at the level of the community as opposed to the individual. So we actually, in our research, use something more akin to a researcher named Nan Lin, who's out of Duke University. And his argument is that this resides at the individual level, right? Your network is an asset that you carry with you through your life that can pay returns. And that sounds a little like callous and creepy and neoconservative of me, but it's actually just the reality that we live every day with our individual networks. And then because we couldn't help ourselves, we came up with a verbose definition of our own. And the reason why we did this is, as for anyone in K-12, this will resonate. Investing in a network before you have any idea what you're going to do is like a little bit of a funny exercise, right? And so we wanted to acknowledge that a network is not sort of a static one point in time thing, but as students are exploring their interests, you actually want to be cultivating networks across those interests and allowing those to then evolve as their interests evolve. Now, relationships themselves, and I don't claim to be an expert in this, but relationships themselves are sort of mysterious things. And we're not going to unpack like all the layers of what a relationship is, but we use in our research sort of a simple model to delineate different types of relationships and the value they offer. So anyone in K-12 is real familiar with strong ties, right? We are all about bringing caring adults into the lives of young people, whether that's educators, community agencies, family community. And strong ties are incredibly important to help us get by. They are more likely to look out for us, to lend us resources. They're the people that we lean on. But the reality is we also have a bunch of these things called weak ties, and that actually sounds like a value judgment. We need to rebrand this. But weak ties are all those people that you kind of know, right? Like I ran into a couple of weak ties in this room. Like, lovely to see you, not gonna ask you if I can borrow money from you, right? Like, just like would not be appropriate. But the reality is that our weak ties actually contain value unto themselves, which sociologists have found is sort of the phenomenon of weak ties having new information and new opportunities, because our weak ties are actually less likely to know one another and less likely to contain the redundant information that our strongest ties do. Now, this becomes really important because this is missing from our youth development framework right now in a big way, and it's actually where, as we'll get to, where technology has a really competitive advantage and an exciting play to make. I also want to just say this is like a simplistic mental model. One of my favorite sociology researchers is a guy named Mario Louis Small. He's at Harvard. He recently came out with a book called Someone to Talk To, and he studied graduate students. So a little bit of like an endangered species population, but let's still just like listen to what he found. He found that new graduate students, as they were experiencing the first sort of throes of graduate school, were not actually turning to their strongest, most trusting relationships when they needed someone to lean on. They were like turning to Uber drivers. They were telling near strangers about what was going on in their lives. And that's actually another missing piece of why I actually think weak ties are an interesting dynamic as we think about broadening or diversifying our young people's networks. Sometimes you want to have a low stakes conversation. And sometimes having that conversation with a formal mentor or even a parent or a sibling can feel higher stakes. So I just want to push on sort of like, even this is a mental model, like everything in research. This may go without saying, but it's worth noting that there is slim but troubling data on the state of young people's networks. And the measures really accord with parental education level and income level. So this is access not to necessarily those caring relationships, but to broader relationships. And here's some of the data. More educated parents, so parents with a college degree or more, are twice as likely to know professors, CEOs, congresspeople. Now, whether you want to know a congressperson in 2019 is a separate conversation, but this is a proxy for those educated parents are disproportionately networked into the knowledge economy, which means they can pick up the phone and get their kids an internship opportunity or an interview, and they can open doors that less educated parents can't necessarily. The other data that we look at is the alarming gap in enrichment spending. So affluent families have lost their minds when it comes to enrichment spending, and this is partly because of the high-octane college application process, as we've been seeing in the news right now. People have truly like gone over the deep end in terms of their moral integrity. But what enrichment spending I see as a proxy for is not getting to like explore a bunch of stuff and do music. I think that's really important. But it actually mirrors data on students' access to informal mentors and non-family adults in their lives. So this is data on young people from the bottom SES quartiles as opposed to the top, and they are reporting fewer non-family adults, which again reflects a network gap that if we care about equity, the achievement gap is not actually giving us all the data on what's going on here. The good news, and this is what all of our research focuses on, and I have 11 minutes to talk about it, so interrupt me if you have questions before I like race through this. The good news is that there's innovations on the horizon, and we're tracking a number of things that I'm going to walk through right now that we see as the most promising antidotes to network gaps, but not just antidotes to network gaps, ways to actually fundamentally reimagine school as a more networked, porous experience with connections beyond the four walls of that school. And these are the three big buckets. The first is integrated student supports. People heard this phrase. So this is kind of wraparound services 2.0. That's the best I can say about it, because people started to study wraparound services models, which were really models that were looking to co-locate a bunch of different supports with the school as a hub. So you can get pediatric care or dental care or after school all in one place. And wraparound services showed some great results in terms of access to care, but they weren't translating into better academic outcomes in a consistent manner. So what we highlight in our research are models that are starting to actually look at not just connecting students to more care and more resources, but connecting the people who are providing that care and resources in a more coherent web. Does that make sense? So that it's not actually a bunch of disparate referrals, it's a coherent set of supports. And we'll get more into a couple examples in a second. The second piece is around EdTech. We're ASU GSV, so I have to say words about technology, but I actually get excited about this one, because like I said, early days in the EdTech market, EdTech was bizarrely antisocial, right? It was this way of actually isolating young people as opposed to connecting them. And what we're starting to see is a host of tools that A, are providing virtual connections that would otherwise be out of reach, and B, are providing sort of marketplaces where you can find people locally to connect with, right? So sort of the Uber of social capital. Now this isn't direct to student, right? This isn't just like, I can see the stranger danger like eyeballs popping out of your heads, but these are teacher-facing tools to find teachers to find guest speakers to start to bring into your classroom, or out-of-school learning opportunities if you're running internship or work-based learning models. And lastly, there's this big bucket around instructional model redesign. And this is an area where I think this is going to be a little bit of a longer horizon for this to happen. But there are people starting to think about work-based learning, project-based learning, all the personalized learning, all the learnings you hear about at conferences like this, where as much as the emphasis has been on let's get students immersed in real-world content and problems, they're actually creating real-world relationships as well. And we'll look at a couple models that do that. So let's go a little deeper. The example that I think best illustrates this trend of integrated student supports, and just to be clear, these are approaches that are shoring up the strong tie network around young people, right? So if you think about that mental model, you need strong ties to sort of get by. And again, our school system is really good at throwing interventions at kids, but less adept at forming a network of care. And so the model I want to highlight here is called City Connects. Folks heard of City Connects? They are out of Boston. Heckinger has covered them. We have Heckinger in the room. They're an organization out of Boston, but they're now scaling nationally. And the City Connects model places a City Connects coordinator in their school partners whose job it is to know every single student and every single family and to create a plan of coordinated care using existing partner agencies. Does that make sense? So they are not providing the services, but they're playing this broker coordinator role. And what's fascinating about City Connects is they're one of the only student support models that's getting consistent academic gains. And their hypothesis that we sort of co-created with them over the past few years is that it's because teachers are being kept in this wraparound services loop. So that school site coordinator is also bringing teachers in. Teachers then know their students better and are able to teach to them more effectively, right? So it's all about that relationship infrastructure that's unlocking better outcomes, not just the resources that out-of-school programs can provide. The next sort of like big layer, and I've already alluded to this, is what we call EdTech that connects. We have a market map at whoyouknow.org of all of the tools we've found thus far that are putting new relationships within reach, so that's a resource for you or your educators. But I want to talk for a second, because I would be remiss if I didn't say the words disruptive innovation, given my job title. I want to talk about why these are disruptive and why they're so exciting. So when we first started looking at this market, I was really worried that like any other researcher, I was going to be like obsolete yesterday, because we are awash in social networking tools, right? We have so many enterprise tools that we can use to make connections. And so why would it matter for EdTech to come into this space? But the reality is a lot of those enterprise tools are never going to solve network gaps, right? On Facebook, how many people are on Facebook? We're sort of the Facebook generation in this room. Oh, not that many. Everyone's like not going to admit it if I am. Any guess at like for Facebook users who have friends, what % of those friends in their like friend network they actually know in real life? Any guess? So I have my friend network of 800 people. How many do I know in real life? 7%? 93%. What that tells us is we are digitizing our offline networks with an online Rolodex. We're not finding new people, right? We're actually using this digital Rolodex to sustain connections that we already have. Now that's actually really exciting, because what it's actually disrupting is the decay rate of our friendships. Decay rate, an easy way to think about this is like you are currently in touch with people you absolutely should not be in touch with anymore, but you've been storing them on ice in your Facebook profile, right? But that's actually really exciting if you think about starting to invest in students' networks and being able to store those and have students keep those relationships warm. I'm mixing metaphors there, but keep them warm, even if they're not sort of keeping in touch on a regular basis. But that's different than diversifying your network. That's different than meeting someone who you would not otherwise meet either because of time constraints, geography constraints, any number of, or just that your school has no sort of way to broker new connections. And so what we're starting to see are folks like Nepris and Dreamwakers. Have folks heard of these tools? So Nepris is offering in-classroom video chats with industry experts so that if a student is growing up in a community where there are no neurosurgeons, suddenly they can actually talk to a neurosurgeon, a real live one, like a real person. Dreamwakers is taking that a step further and saying, that's great, but all too often for young people on the wrong side of the opportunity equation, we're putting them in connection with people who don't look like them. And that can actually cause stereotype threat. So Dreamwakers is recruiting role models who resemble the students they are serving, whether that's low income, minority, differently abled, and allowing students to connect with people with whom they can more relate. Again, online, because those relationships might not be within reach immediately in their community. We're also seeing this start to sort of crop up in the higher ed space. The last example I'll give here is Student Success Agency. Anyone heard of them? So this is in the guidance space. I actually felt like there would be more like guidance conversations happening at ASU this year. And they weren't, but maybe next year. We all know that there's a guidance counselor crisis in this country, right? So the statistics put the average at 492 students to one guidance counselor, which means that some estimates say that you're getting 38 minutes a year with your guidance counselor to make major life decisions, right? And maybe you have an inherited network of people or chance encounters and the luck of having people who are gonna help you make informed decisions, but maybe you don't. And Student Success Agency is a marketplace of online near-peer mentors providing college guidance and advice. Now, they're not professional certified guidance counselors. They're a supplementary tool, but the exciting thing from an output standpoint is that they've gotten to 38 minutes a month. So you're able to radically increase dosage when you start to take advantage of the efficiencies of technology. Sorry, last thing to say here on disruptive innovation theory. The temptation is to sort of say, okay, great, this can replace face-to-face relationships, right? And that is the apocalypse that we want to avoid. Where technology has the greatest potential is to go after what we would call in our research non-consumption, areas where relationships are not currently on offer. And therefore, you're not putting these in competition with face-to-face. You're not using this as a surrogate for strong ties. You're actually using it as a tool where otherwise the alternative is nothing at all. And it has an immense power to actually leverage what we talked about before, which is the strength of weak ties, right? So this like online guidance counselor, that's not gonna be a strong tie. Again, like probably inappropriate to ask them if you can borrow money, but totally a new source of information that wasn't in your existing network. Does that make sense? So we shouldn't dismiss them. When I go to mentoring conferences, people look at me like I am the devil, because mentoring organizations are the sort of Cadillac of relationships. They want those strong ties, and they are absolutely critical, but why not use technology to supplement and diversify weak ties? That's sort of the question we ask and where we see the greatest potential. And the last piece, and I'm gonna call out, we have Blue Valley CAPS in the corner here and Seminole County, which they also haven't met. Half of my life is just connecting people who care about social capital, because there's like 10 of them in the world, so I'm always trying to connect them. But we have people who are playing with instructional models and saying, okay, project-based learning, real-world learning, work-based learning, these are all really exciting, but let's think about those new instructional models as a chance to start to diversify students' access to industry professionals that they might not otherwise know. And so a couple examples up here. Big Picture Learning is really well known. They've been around for about 3 decades doing internship-based learning in the community. It's a high school model. And they're currently, actually, back to the technology slide, building a platform called Imblaze to help coordinate those. I'm also really excited about a group called Da Vinci Extension out in LA. It's a 5th-year high school, and what they've started to do is that it was too burdensome to run an internship program for all their students, right? Not to mention, no ding on internships, but there can be a lot of lost learning time where you're sitting in a corner, filing or answering phones, not interacting with anyone, and not actually doing cognitively demanding work. So to solve for that, Da Vinci Extension actually started to do what they call project consults, which are shorter engagements where they meet a couple times with an industry partner, come up with a project, execute on it, still get feedback, and still explicitly build a weak tie relationship with industry, but it's not nearly the heavy lift or potential lost learning time of something like a full-fledged internship. And we're also seeing this start to emerge in higher ed. So with 33 seconds left, there's like a timer blinking at me right now. I'm just going to put up 3 little provocations that I hope you took away from this, which is that I'm not suggesting that schools are antisocial environments, but I'm suggesting that we are not optimizing for students' access to networks in our current system. I'm also not suggesting that you can network your way out of poverty, but I think in our conversation about equity and access to opportunity, we are leaving out access to networks as a critical ingredient, but luckily we have these innovations starting to emerge. And then lastly, despite the fact that I work for Clayton Christensen, who's all about making predictions, turns out we can't fully predict the future. And in some ways, I think of a network almost like a stock portfolio. You want to diversify it because you don't know what's going to come up in your life, and you want to have people that you can lean on and turn to and who can open doors for you. So 16 seconds left, but come up and say hi. I'm an introvert, ironically, so come up and say hi, but then I'm going to scurry away. Take care.